The Nevada desert had never been kind to dreamers, but it had been particularly cruel to Marcus Chen. 3 years of drought had turned his once thriving cattle ranch into a graveyard of cracked earth and broken promises. The morning sun cast long shadows across the withered pastures as he stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the last of his water reserves slowly evaporate under the relentless sky. At 35, Marcus carried the weight of generations on his shoulders. The Chen family had worked this land for over a century, transforming it from wild desert into something resembling paradise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His great-grandfather had planted the first mesquite trees, his grandfather had dug the original wells, and his father had built the sprawling adobe house that now felt too large, too empty, too full of memories that tasted like dust and regret. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional whisper of wind through the dried grass. Even the coyotes had moved on, seeking water elsewhere. Marcus took a sip of his bitter coffee and grimaced, not from the taste but from the letter folded in his shirt pocket. The bank's final notice crinkled against his chest with each breath, a paper countdown to the end of everything his family had built. He was considering whether to feed the last of his grain to his remaining horses when he saw it, a shimmer in the heat waves rising from the desert floor, something that didn't belong in his world of practical concerns and financial ruin. At first, he thought it was another mirage, the kind that had been taunting him for weeks with promises of water that never materialized. But this shimmer moved with purpose, growing larger and more distinct as it approached his property. As the figure drew closer, Marcus squinted against the morning glare, his practical mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. A woman walked across his desert, but she moved unlike anyone he'd ever seen. Her steps seemed to barely touch the ground, as if the earth itself was helping her along, and around her swirled something that made the air itself dance with colors that had no names. She wore a flowing dress that seemed to be cut from captured starlight, shifting from deep purple to silver to gold as she moved. Her dark hair hung in intricate braids adorned with what looked like actual butterfly wings, though they moved with their own life, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in prismatic patterns. But it was what she carried that made Marcus set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. In one arm, she cradled a leather valise that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The case was old, worn smooth by countless journeys, but from its slightly open seams, butterfly wings escaped in lazy spirals, each one a different color, each one impossibly beautiful. Some were transparent as glass, others deep as midnight, and a few seemed to be made of pure sunlight itself. They emerged from the valise like living jewels, circling the woman before dissolving into sparkles that fell like gentle rain onto the parched earth. But if the butterfly wings were impossible, what followed behind her was beyond all reason. A goat walked beside the woman, but this was no ordinary farm animal. It stood nearly 4 feet tall, with fur that shifted from white to silver to deep blue depending on the angle of the light. Its eyes were ancient, holding wisdom that seemed to span centuries, and from its mouth came sounds that were definitely not bleating. The creature was humming, a low melodic tune that seemed to make the very air around them shimmer and bend. As they approached his fence line, Marcus noticed something that made his practical rancher's mind reel. Where the woman's feet touched the ground, tiny flowers bloomed instantly in the cracked earth. Desert marigolds, Indian paintbrush, and species he didn't recognize burst into life with each step, creating a trail of impossible color across his drought-stricken land. The goat's hooves left similar marks, but instead of flowers, small springs of clear water bubbled up, soaking into the thirsty soil with audible sighs of relief. Marcus rubbed his eyes, certain that the desert heat was finally getting to him, that 3 years of watching his dreams die had finally broken something essential in his mind. But when he looked again, the woman and her impossible companion were still there, now close enough that he could see the delicate patterns embroidered on her dress, symbols that seemed to move and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The goat raised its head and looked directly at Marcus, and in that moment he felt something pass between them, a recognition that went deeper than sight or sound. The creature's ancient eyes seemed to say, "We have been looking for you, Marcus Chen. We have traveled far to find this place, this moment, this man who stands at the crossroads of despair and hope." The woman approached his gate, which stood slightly ajar, secured only by a length of rope that had seen better years. She paused there, her hand resting on the weathered wood, and for the first time since she had appeared on his horizon, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were the color of deep forest pools, green with flecks of gold that seemed to move like living things. When she smiled, Marcus felt something in his chest that he thought had died with the last rain. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying easily across the distance between them, musical and warm like honey poured over velvet. "I'm looking for someone who might need what I carry." Marcus found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, rusty from too many days of talking only to his horses and the empty sky. "Depends on what you're selling, miss. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to buy much of anything these days." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal and starlight. "I'm not selling anything. I'm giving away exactly what people need, though they rarely know they need it until they see it." She lifted the valise slightly, and more butterfly wings escaped, these ones seeming to carry tiny lights in their translucent membranes. "May I come in? My companion and I have traveled a very long way, and we could use some shade and perhaps a drink of water." Marcus looked at his empty water troughs, at his dried well, at the testament to failure that his ranch had become. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer in the way of water," he admitted, the words tasting like defeat. "Haven't had decent water in months." The goat made a sound that was definitely not a bleat, something closer to a chuckle mixed with the sound of distant thunder. It walked to his gate and gently nudged it open with its nose, the rope falling away as if it had been waiting for permission to release its hold. The creature stepped onto his property and immediately lowered its head to the ground, pressing its forehead against the cracked earth. What happened next made Marcus question everything he thought he knew about the world. The ground beneath the goat began to glow with a soft blue light, and the sound of rushing water filled the air. Before Marcus could process what he was seeing, a spring bubbled up from the exact spot where the goat's head touched the earth. Clear, cold water flowed freely, more water than Marcus had seen on his property in 3 years. "Barnabas is very good with water," the woman said casually, as if magical goats were the most normal thing in the world. "He has a particular talent for finding what's hidden beneath the surface." She stepped through the open gate, and immediately Marcus's dying lawn began to respond to her presence. Grass that had been brown and brittle for months suddenly straightened, taking on a healthy green color that spread outward from her feet like ripples in a pond. Marcus stood frozen on his porch, watching as his property transformed before his eyes. The woman and her goat moved across his yard, leaving behind them a trail of impossible life. Dead shrubs burst into bloom, his withered vegetable garden suddenly heavy with tomatoes and peppers that definitely hadn't been there that morning. And everywhere the butterfly wings from her valise landed, new flowers pushed through the soil with almost audible enthusiasm. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered to himself, but he said it without conviction, because impossible was walking across his ranch, healing 3 years of drought with every step. The woman approached his porch, and up close, Marcus could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with skin that seemed to hold a faint luminescence, and hands that moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to working with delicate, powerful things. The butterfly wings in her hair rustled softly, and he realized they weren't decorations at all but living creatures that had chosen to make their home in her dark braids. "My name is Luna Brightwater," she said, extending a hand that felt warm and somehow electric when Marcus shook it. "And this is Barnabas." The goat had finished creating his spring and now stood beside Luna, his strange blue-silver fur perfectly clean despite having just pressed his head into the earth. "We're traveling through, helping where we can, and we sensed that this place, that you, might benefit from what we have to offer." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus found himself staring into Luna's eyes, trying to find some rational explanation for what he was witnessing. "What exactly do you have to offer? Because if you're some kind of traveling salesperson with a really elaborate magic show, I should tell you up front that I'm about to lose this place. The bank owns more of it than I do at this point." Luna's expression softened with genuine compassion. "I know about the drought, Marcus. I know about the letter in your pocket and the weight you carry. I know about your great-grandfather's trees and your father's dreams and how you've been wondering if you're the Chen who finally fails." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But mostly, I know that you still believe in impossible things, even when you tell yourself you don't." The accuracy of her observations should have been alarming, but instead, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief, as if someone had finally seen past his stoic facade to the fear and longing beneath. "How could you possibly know any of that?" Luna smiled and opened her valise completely for the first time. Inside, Marcus caught glimpses of wonders that made his mind spin. There were butterfly wings, yes, hundreds of them, in every color imaginable. But there were also small bottles filled with what looked like captured moonbeams, tiny scrolls covered in writing that seemed to move across the paper, seeds that glowed with their own inner fire, and things that he couldn't begin to identify but that hummed with power and possibility. "I know because Barnabas and I specialize in finding people who are at crossroads," Luna explained, carefully selecting a butterfly wing that shimmered like oil on water. "People who have reached the end of what they think is possible and are ready to consider that maybe, just maybe, the world is bigger and more magical than they were taught to believe." She held the butterfly wing up to the light, and Marcus saw that it wasn't just beautiful, it was functional. Tiny symbols covered its surface, and as he watched, they rearranged themselves into patterns that seemed to speak directly to his heart. The wing pulsed gently, and he felt an odd sensation, as if something inside him that had been locked away was beginning to stir. "What does it do?" he asked, surprised by how much he wanted to believe that it could do anything at all. "This particular wing carries the memory of rain," Luna said softly. "Not just any rain, but the kind that falls when the earth has been waiting so long that every drop is a celebration. When you release it, it doesn't just bring water, it brings the joy that water represents, the hope that comes with new growth, the faith that even the driest season eventually ends." Barnabas made a sound of agreement, his ancient eyes fixed on Marcus with what looked remarkably like encouragement. The goat had positioned himself near the newly created spring, and Marcus noticed that the water flowing from it had begun to form small streams, carrying life to parts of his property that had been barren for years. "I don't understand any of this," Marcus admitted, though he found himself stepping closer to Luna and her impossible valise. "Magic isn't real. I mean, it can't be real, can it? I'm a rancher. I deal with practical things, with cattle and fences and bank loans and drought. I don't deal with butterfly wings that control the weather." Luna's laugh was gentle, understanding. "Magic is the most practical thing in the world, Marcus. It's just that most people have forgotten how to see it. They've convinced themselves that if something can't be measured or explained or controlled, it doesn't exist. But deep down, they still remember. They still look up at the stars and wonder, still feel their hearts lift when they see a sunset, still believe in love, even though love makes no logical sense at all." She reached into her valise again and withdrew something that made Marcus's breath catch. It was a small glass sphere filled with what looked like captured sunlight, but as he watched, the light began to take shape, forming tiny images that moved like scenes from a movie. He saw his ranch as it had been in his grandfather's time, green and thriving, with cattle grazing in lush pastures and children playing in the yard. He saw possibilities, futures that could exist if only he had the courage to reach for them. "This is what your land remembers," Luna said softly. "This is what it's capable of becoming again, if you're willing to work with forces that go beyond irrigation systems and weather patterns." Marcus stared at the sphere, feeling something crack open inside his chest. "Even if this is real, even if you can somehow bring back the rain and make my land green again, what's the catch? Nothing like this comes free, especially not for someone who's already lost everything." Luna set the sphere carefully back in her valise and looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "The only price is faith, Marcus. Faith that the world is bigger than your fear, that hope is stronger than experience, that sometimes the best way to save something is to let it become something new." Barnabas wandered over to Marcus's dying mesquite trees, the ones his great-grandfather had planted with such care over a century ago. The goat began to hum again, that strange melody that seemed to make the air itself dance, and, as he did, the trees began to respond. New leaves unfurled from branches that had been bare for months, and tiny flowers appeared where there had been only brown bark and disappointment. "How is he doing that?" Marcus whispered, watching as decades of drought damage reversed itself in minutes. "Barnabas remembers what these trees were meant to be," Luna explained. He's simply reminding them that being alive is their natural state, that growth and flowering are what they were designed for. Sometimes things just need permission to be what they truly are. Marcus walked down from his porch, drawn by something he couldn't name. Up close, the transformation was even more incredible. The trees weren't just healing, they were thriving, becoming more beautiful and vital than they had ever been in his memory. The air around them shimmered with possibility, and he could swear he heard music in the rustling of their new leaves. "This is impossible," he said again, but this time the words carried wonder instead of denial. Luna joined him beneath the trees, butterfly wings escaping from her valise to dance among the new blossoms. "Impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet," she said. "Every great change starts with someone willing to believe in something that doesn't make sense to anyone else." Marcus reached out tentatively to touch one of the new leaves, half expecting it to dissolve at his touch like a mirage. But it was real, solid, alive with a vitality that seemed to pulse against his fingertips. "If you can do all this, if you really have the power to bring back the rain and save my ranch, why are you here? Why help someone you don't even know?" Luna was quiet for a moment, watching as more butterfly wings emerged from her valise to join their companions in the dancing air above them. "Because everyone deserves to see their impossible dreams come true, Marcus. Because the world needs more people who remember that magic is real, that hope is not naive, that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is believe in miracles." She paused, her expression growing serious. "And because Barnabas and I are looking for someone who understands that magic isn't about controlling the world. It's about working with it. Someone who knows that the best way to ground lightning is not to fight it, but to give it a safe place to land." Marcus felt something shift inside him, like tumblers falling into place in a lock he hadn't known existed. "Is that what you meant when you said magic needs grounding?" Luna nodded, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "Magic without grounding is just chaos. Beautiful but destructive. But magic with the right foundation, magic worked by someone who understands both its power and its responsibility, that can change everything." Barnabas had moved on to Marcus's dying vegetable garden, and everywhere the goat's hooves touched, new life exploded from the soil. Tomatoes swelled from tiny buds to full ripeness in seconds, corn stalks shot up from the ground like green fountains, and beans wound themselves around stakes that materialized from thin air, heavy with pods that gleamed like emeralds in the strange, shimmering light that seemed to follow Luna wherever she went. "This is all happening too fast," Marcus said, though he couldn't keep the excitement out of his voice. "I should be scared, or skeptical, or at least confused. Instead, I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for someone to show up with a valise full of butterfly wings and tell me that impossible things are possible." Luna smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Marcus saw something vulnerable in her expression. "That's because you have been waiting, Marcus. We all have, in one way or another. The question is, what are you going to do now that the waiting is over?" Marcus looked around his property, seeing it not as the failure it had become, but as the canvas for possibilities it could be. With Luna's magic and his knowledge of the land, with Barnabas's gift for finding hidden water and his own understanding of what this desert could support, they could create something unprecedented. Not just a ranch, but a place where magic and practicality worked together, where impossible things happened so regularly that they became possible, where the line between dream and reality blurred until it disappeared entirely. "I don't know the first thing about magic," he admitted. "I can fix fences and deliver calves and read weather patterns, but I've never worked with butterfly wings that control rain or goats that can make springs appear out of nowhere." Luna reached into her valise and withdrew a butterfly wing unlike any of the others. This one was clear as crystal but shot through with veins of deep blue and silver, and when she held it up to the light, Marcus saw his own face reflected in its surface, but changed somehow, more confident, more alive, more connected to the world around him. "Magic isn't something you learn, Marcus. It's something you remember. It's something you were born knowing how to do before the world taught you to believe only in things you could touch and measure and control." She held the wing out to him. "This one is yours if you want it. It carries the memory of who you were before you forgot that miracles were your birthright." Marcus stared at the wing, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Taking it would mean accepting that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong, or at least incomplete. It would mean stepping into a future that had no guarantees, no precedents, no practical guidelines. It would mean trusting a woman he'd just met, a goat that could create springs, and his own capacity to work with forces he didn't understand. But it would also mean hope. It would mean the possibility of saving not just his ranch but transforming it into something beyond his wildest dreams. It would mean partnership with someone who saw magic as naturally as he saw sunrise, who believed in impossible things with the same confidence he'd once had in his ability to coax life from difficult soil. "What happens if I take it?" he asked. Luna's smile was radiant. "Then you find out what it feels like to remember that you were never meant to face the impossible alone." Marcus reached out and took the butterfly wing from her hand. The moment his fingers touched it, the world exploded into color and sensation and possibility. He felt the wing dissolve against his palm, but instead of disappearing, it seemed to flow into his skin, into his blood, into the very core of who he was. Suddenly, he could feel the hidden water table beneath his feet, could sense the potential life sleeping in every seed scattered across his property, could hear the desert itself humming with magic that had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. "Oh," he breathed, understanding flooding through him like a warm tide. "Oh, I see now." Luna laughed with delight. "What do you see, Marcus?" He looked at her, then at Barnabas, then at his land with eyes that finally knew how to see. "I see that you didn't just show up here by accident. I see that this has all been leading somewhere. That drought and loss and impossible visitors are all part of something bigger. I see that magic isn't about making the world do what you want. It's about helping it become what it was always meant to be." Barnabas made a sound of approval and began to glow with soft blue light. As he did, springs began to appear all across Marcus's property, not just one or two, but dozens, each one feeding streams that connected to form a network of flowing water that brought life wherever it touched. The air filled with the sound of rushing water and growing things and butterfly wings, and Marcus realized that he was laughing, deep belly laughs that seemed to rise from a place in him that had been silent for too long. "So, what happens now?" he asked, when he could speak again. Luna closed her valise and slung it over her shoulder, but not before Marcus saw that it was still full, still brimming with wonders he couldn't name. "Now we find out what kind of magic you and I can make together. Now we discover what happens when someone who knows how to work with the land partners with someone who knows how to work with the impossible. Now we see what this place becomes when drought is replaced by abundance, when fear gives way to faith, when practical magic meets magical practicality." She paused, looking around at the transformation they had already begun. "But first, I think we should probably figure out where Barnabas and I are going to sleep tonight, because creating this much magic all at once is exhausting work, and tomorrow we have a lot more impossible things to accomplish." Marcus felt a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "I've got plenty of room in the house, and more guest beds than I've had use for in years. But I should warn you, I'm not much of a cook, and I don't have any idea what goats who cast spells like to eat." Barnabas wandered over and gently butted Marcus's hand with his head, a gesture that felt remarkably like affection. The goat's fur was softer than anything Marcus had ever touched, and he could feel a warm contentment radiating from the creature that spoke of long journeys, faithful service, and the joy of finally finding the right place to rest. "Barnabas is easy," Luna said, reaching over to scratch behind the goat's ears. "He mostly lives on sunlight and good intentions, though he does have a weakness for apple cores and the occasional handful of oats. As for cooking, don't worry about it. I've learned to make magic work in the kitchen, too." As they walked toward the house, Marcus noticed that the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed more vivid than any sunset he could remember. But more than that, he noticed clouds gathering on the horizon, thick and heavy with the promise of rain. Real rain, the kind that soaked deep into the earth and stayed, the kind that brought life instead of just temporary relief. "Is that your doing?" he asked, nodding toward the approaching storm. Luna shook her head. "That's the land's doing. Magic doesn't create what isn't already possible, Marcus. It just helps things become what they were always meant to be. Your ranch was always meant to be green and thriving. The drought was the aberration, not the abundance that's coming." They reached the porch just as the first drops began to fall, fat and warm and full of the scent of growing things. Marcus stood in his doorway, watching as rain fell on his property for the first time in 3 years, watching as every drop seemed to contain its own small miracle. The butterfly wings that had escaped from Luna's valise danced in the rainfall, their movements creating patterns of light that turned the storm into something resembling a celebration. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt inadequate for what he was feeling. Luna paused in the doorway, her hair damp with rain and her eyes bright with something that might have been joy or relief or hope. "Don't thank me yet, Marcus. This is just the beginning. Tomorrow we start the real work of finding out what magic looks like when it has somewhere safe to land." As they stepped inside, Marcus realized that for the first time since the drought began, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not with the grim determination that had carried him through the last 3 years, but with genuine excitement about what the new day might bring. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the sound of water hitting parched earth, he could swear he heard the desert laughing. Dawn broke differently over the Chen ranch, as if the very quality of light had changed overnight. Marcus woke to sounds he hadn't heard in years, the gentle splash of water flowing over stone, the rustle of leaves heavy with moisture, and something else entirely new, a melodic humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He lay in bed for a moment, wondering if the previous day had been an elaborate dream brought on by too much desert heat and financial stress. Then he heard Luna's laughter floating through his kitchen window, musical and bright, followed by Barnabas making sounds that definitely weren't normal goat noises. Marcus threw on his clothes and hurried downstairs, barefoot on the cool wooden floors that hadn't felt cool in months. The sight that greeted him in his kitchen stopped him cold. Luna stood at his ancient stove, somehow coaxing flames from burners that hadn't worked properly in 2 years. But these weren't ordinary flames. They danced in shades of blue and silver, responding to her gestures like eager students following a beloved teacher's direction. Above the stove, butterfly wings from her valise hovered in precise formations, their wings beating in perfect synchronization to fan the heat exactly where it was needed. On the counter beside her, ingredients that definitely hadn't been in his pantry the night before were arranged with artistic precision. Fresh eggs that seemed to glow with their own inner light, milk that swirled with tiny silver spirals, flour that sparkled like crushed diamonds, and berries and colors he was certain didn't exist in nature. The entire kitchen smelled like cinnamon and starlight and possibilities he couldn't name. "Good morning, Marcus," Luna said without turning around, as if she'd sensed his presence through some means beyond normal perception. "I hope you don't mind that I took some liberties with breakfast. Barnabas was quite insistent that we needed something special to fuel what we're planning today." Barnabas stood near the kitchen window, his strange blue-silver fur gleaming in the morning light. The goat had somehow managed to communicate his breakfast preferences to Luna, though Marcus couldn't imagine how. As he watched, Barnabas nodded approvingly at whatever Luna was cooking, then turned to regard Marcus with those ancient, knowing eyes. "What exactly are we planning today?" Marcus asked, accepting the cup of coffee that Luna handed him without looking away from her cooking. The coffee was perfect, stronger and more flavorful than anything he'd ever made in this kitchen, and it seemed to clear his head and energize his body in ways that went beyond normal caffeine. Luna finally turned to face him, and Marcus felt his breath catch. In the morning light, she was even more beautiful than she'd seemed the night before, but it was a beauty that went deeper than mere physical appearance. She radiated vitality and purpose and joy, as if she carried her own personal sunrise wherever she went. The butterfly wings in her hair caught the light from her magical flames, creating patterns of color that danced across the kitchen walls. "Today we find out what happens when your knowledge of this land combines with the possibilities in my valise," she said, flipping what looked like pancakes but moved like living things, adjusting their color and thickness as they cooked. "Today we discover what kind of magic you and I can create together when we stop thinking about what's impossible and start focusing on what's necessary." She gestured toward the window, and Marcus looked out to see his property in full daylight for the first time since Luna's arrival. The transformation was even more dramatic than he'd realized. Where yesterday there had been cracked earth and dying vegetation, now there were streams and pools and gardens that looked like they'd been tended by master gardeners for decades. His cattle, the few head he'd managed to keep alive through the drought, stood belly deep in lush grass that definitely hadn't existed 12 hours ago. But it was more than just the sudden abundance that took his breath away. Everything on his land seemed more alive, more vibrant, more connected than it had ever been. He could see networks of flowing water that created perfect irrigation systems, Fruit trees heavy with produce that should have taken years to mature, and everywhere he looked, flowers and butterflies and birds that had returned, as if summoned by some force he was only beginning to understand. "How is this possible?" he whispered, though he was beginning to suspect that possible was a word that no longer applied to his life. Luna set a plate in front of him, and Marcus stared at what appeared to be the most perfect breakfast he'd ever seen. The pancakes were golden and fluffy, but as he watched, they shifted through different flavors and textures, becoming exactly what he was craving from moment to moment. Sometimes they tasted like his grandmother's recipe, sometimes like exotic spices he'd never encountered, sometimes like pure sunshine and happiness. "It's possible because you made it possible, Marcus," Luna said, settling into the chair across from him with her own plate. "The magic I carry can create temporary wonders, brief miracles that fade when I move on. But what happened here last night, what's still happening, that's different. That's what occurs when magic finds someone who knows how to nurture it, how to help it take root and grow into something sustainable." Barnabas wandered over and rested his chin on Marcus's knee, a gesture that felt remarkably like a request for attention. When Marcus reached down to scratch behind the goat's ears, he felt a warm pulse of energy pass between them, and suddenly he could sense things he'd never been aware of before. He could feel the underground water table, stronger and more abundant than it had been in decades. He could sense the network of roots and fungi and tiny creatures that connected every living thing on his property. He could hear what Luna had called the Earth's humming, a deep harmonic vibration that seemed to rise from the planet's very core. "I can feel it," he said in wonder. "I can feel the land like it's part of me, like it's been trying to talk to me for years and I finally learned how to listen." Luna smiled, and Marcus realized that this was what she'd been waiting for, this moment of recognition and connection. "That's your gift, Marcus. Not everyone who encounters magic can ground it the way you can. Most people, even good people with pure intentions, can only hold on to it for a short time before it either burns them out or slips away. But you have something different. You have the ability to take magical energy and weave it into the fabric of the physical world so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from natural law." She reached across the table and took his hand, and when their fingers touched, Marcus felt the same electric connection he'd experienced the night before, but stronger now, more focused. "That's why Barnabas and I have been searching for you, though we didn't know it was you specifically, until we found you. We've been looking for someone who could be our partner, someone who could help us do more than just provide temporary relief to people in crisis." Marcus felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness mixed with excitement. "What kind of partnership are you talking about?" Luna stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape with an expression that mixed satisfaction with longing. "There are others, Marcus. So many others who are facing impossible situations, who've reached the end of what they think they can survive, farmers whose crops have failed, families who've lost everything to forces beyond their control, entire communities that have given up hope because hope seems naive in the face of their reality." She turned back to him, her eyes bright with passion and purpose. "Barnabas and I can help them, but only temporarily. We can create miracles that last for days or weeks, but eventually the magic fades, and they're back where they started, sometimes worse off, because they've had a taste of what's possible. But if we had a place to bring them, a place where magic is so deeply rooted that it's self-sustaining, a place where people could learn to work with forces beyond the ordinary," Marcus began to understand what she was proposing, and the scope of it both thrilled and terrified him. "You want to turn my ranch into some kind of magical sanctuary." "Not just a sanctuary," Luna said, her voice growing more animated as she spoke. "A training ground, a demonstration site, a place where people can see that magic isn't just fantasy or wishful thinking, but a practical tool for solving real problems. A place where the impossible becomes possible so regularly that it stops being impossible and starts being just another way of working with the world." Barnabas made a sound of agreement and wandered over to the kitchen door, nosing it open with practiced ease. Through the doorway, Marcus could see more of his transformed property, and he noticed something he'd missed before. There were structures appearing that he was certain hadn't been there the night before. Not built structures, but grown ones, as if the earth itself was reshaping itself to create spaces for specific purposes. "What are those?" he asked, pointing to what looked like a natural amphitheater formed from living stone and earth, surrounded by fruit trees and flowering vines. Luna's smile was radiant. Those are Barnabas's contribution to our partnership. He has a gift for creating spaces where magic can be taught and learned safely. The amphitheater is for group lessons, the workshop areas are for individual instruction, and the garden spaces are for practicing what we call collaborative magic, working with natural systems instead of trying to override them. Marcus walked outside, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense of wonder. Up close, the structures were even more impressive. They seemed to have grown from the landscape itself, perfectly integrated with the natural contours of his land. Everything was functional and beautiful, designed with an understanding of both practical needs and aesthetic harmony that went far beyond normal architecture. But it was more than just the physical structures that amazed him. As he walked among them, he could feel the purpose they'd been created for, the intention that had been woven into their very substance. These weren't just buildings, they were tools, designed to focus and amplify magical energy in ways that made it safer and more accessible for people who didn't have Luna's natural abilities. "How many people are you thinking of bringing here?" he asked, trying to wrap his mind around the implications of what Luna was proposing. "As many as we can help," she said simply, "but we'll start small, with individuals and families who are facing crises that conventional solutions can't address. People like you were yesterday. People who've reached the end of their rope and are ready to consider that maybe there are other ropes they haven't seen yet." She paused beside what looked like a workshop area, complete with tools that seemed to be made from crystallized light and workbenches that hummed with their own internal energy. "The beauty of grounded magic, Marcus, is that it's self-perpetuating. Every person who learns to work with it becomes capable of teaching others, of creating their own small miracles that ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. What we're talking about isn't just helping a few people solve their immediate problems. We're talking about seeding a transformation that could eventually touch thousands of lives." Marcus felt the weight of what she was suggesting settle over him like a mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to wear. "This is a lot more responsibility than I bargained for when I took that butterfly wing from you." Luna's expression grew gentle, understanding. "I know it is, and I know how overwhelming it must seem. If you're not ready, if this isn't what you want for your life, then we can find another way. Barnabas and I can help you save your ranch and then move on, leaving you with enough grounded magic to keep this place thriving for generations. There's no obligation, no pressure to become something you don't want to be." She walked over to a small pool that had formed where several of Barnabas's springs converged, and she trailed her fingers in the clear water. As she did, images began to form on the surface, pictures of other places, other people, other possibilities. Marcus saw a fishing village where the nets were always full, a desert community where fruit trees grew in impossible abundance, a mountain town where the sick were healed by springs that bubbled with more than just mineral water. "But if you are ready," Luna continued softly, "if you can imagine yourself not just as a rancher but as a teacher, a guardian, a bridge between the world of practical necessity and the realm of magical possibility, then we could create something unprecedented here, something that would make your great-grandfather's dreams look small by comparison." Marcus stared at the images in the water, seeing not just what Luna and Barnabas had accomplished in other places, but what they could accomplish together if he found the courage to step fully into this new role. He saw his ranch not just as a place where cattle grazed and crops grew, but as a center of learning and transformation, a place where people came to discover abilities they'd never known they possessed. "What would I need to learn?" he asked, and he realized as the words left his mouth that his question had already answered Luna's proposal. He wasn't asking whether he should do this, he was asking how. Luna's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "You'd need to learn to work with different types of magical energy, to recognize when someone is ready for transformation and when they need more time. To teach practical magic in ways that don't overwhelm or frighten people who've never encountered it before. But mostly, you'd need to learn to trust yourself, to believe that you're capable of responsibilities you've never imagined taking on." Barnabas wandered over and began to glow with that soft blue light Marcus was beginning to recognize as a sign of the goat's approval. As the light intensified, more changes began to appear across the landscape. Gardens rearranged themselves to create more efficient growing patterns, streams adjusted their courses to provide better irrigation, and everywhere Marcus looked, the land seemed to be optimizing itself for purposes he was only beginning to understand. "When would we start?" Marcus asked, though part of him suspected they already had. "We already have," Luna said, confirming his suspicion. The moment you accepted that butterfly wing, the moment you opened yourself to the possibility that magic could be practical and practical knowledge could be magical, we began the transformation process. What you're seeing around you now isn't just the result of my abilities or Barnabas's gifts. It's what happens when your deep understanding of this land combines with our ability to unlock its hidden potential. She gestured toward a structure that was still forming, growing from the earth like a time-lapse video of a plant reaching toward the sun. That's going to be living quarters for people who need to stay here while they learn. The walls are made from a combination of adobe and crystallized intention, which means they'll automatically adjust to provide exactly the environment each resident needs for optimal learning and healing. Marcus watched in fascination as the building continued to grow and shape itself, developing windows and doors and interior spaces with an organic logic that was both practical and beautiful. How do you know all this will work? Have you created other places like this before? Luna's expression grew wistful. We've tried, Marcus. Barnabas and I have been traveling together for more years than I like to count, helping where we can, but always moving on before we could see the long-term results of our work. We found people with potential, places that could have become centers of transformation, but we've never found the right combination of factors that would allow us to stay, to build something permanent. She paused, watching as butterfly wings from her valise began to settle on the new building, their presence somehow accelerating and refining the construction process. What's different about you, about this place, is that you don't just have the ability to ground magic. You have the wisdom to use it responsibly, the patience to teach it gradually, and the deep connection to the land that makes sustainable transformation possible. Barnabas finished his work on the building and trotted over to where Marcus and Luna stood talking. The goat looked up at Marcus with those ancient eyes, and again, Marcus felt that sense of communication that went beyond words. This time, what he sensed from Barnabas was something like gratitude, mixed with relief, as if the goat had been carrying a burden for a very long time and had finally found someone willing to share the load. What's his story? Marcus asked, reaching down to scratch behind Barnabas's ears. How did he learn to create springs and grow buildings? Luna's smile grew fond as she looked at her companion. Barnabas is older than he looks, and he's seen more of the world than most humans ever will. He was born in a place where magic and nature were so intertwined that there was no distinction between them, where every creature understood its role in maintaining the balance between what is and what could be. She knelt beside the goat, her hands moving through his strange fur with the familiarity of long partnership. When that place was destroyed by people who feared what they couldn't control, Barnabas became one of the few survivors of a way of life that most of the world has forgotten. He's been searching ever since for a place where that balance could be restored, where magic could once again become as natural and essential as breathing. Marcus felt a deep sadness wash over him as he understood what Luna was telling him. And you? What's your story? Luna stood and walked to the edge of the pool, her reflection wavering in the water disturbed by a slight breeze. I was born into a family that remembered the old ways, that understood magic as a responsibility rather than a power. My grandmother carried a valise like mine, and her grandmother before her, passing down not just the tools, but the knowledge of how to use them wisely. She opened her valise and withdrew a small, leather-bound book that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. This contains everything my family learned over generations about working with magical forces safely and sustainably. How to recognize when someone is ready for transformation. How to ground magic so it doesn't fade or become destructive. How to teach others to carry on the work when we're no longer able to do it ourselves. Marcus accepted the book when she offered it to him, and immediately felt the weight of knowledge it contained. As he opened it, words appeared on the pages in handwriting that shifted and changed, sometimes appearing in languages he didn't recognize, sometimes manifesting as symbols or diagrams that somehow conveyed meaning directly to his mind. This is incredible, he whispered, turning pages that seemed to respond to his thoughts, showing him exactly the information he needed to understand at each moment. But why are you giving it to me? Surely this belongs to your family. Luna's expression grew solemn. My family is gone, Marcus. I'm the last one who remembers the old ways, the last one who carries the responsibility of keeping this knowledge alive. For years I've been traveling with Barnabas, trying to use what I know to help people, but always moving on before I could teach anyone else to carry on the work. She returned to his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. What I'm offering you isn't just partnership in helping others. I'm offering you the chance to become the guardian of knowledge that could otherwise die with me. I'm asking you to help me ensure that the wisdom of generations doesn't disappear from the world entirely." The weight of what she was proposing settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket, but it wasn't an uncomfortable weight. Instead, it felt like the sensation of finally understanding his purpose, of discovering what he was meant to do with his life beyond simply surviving from day to day. "What happened to your family?" he asked gently. Luna was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that Marcus couldn't see. The same thing that happened to Barnabas's homeland, though it took longer and was more subtle. Fear, mostly. Fear of things that couldn't be controlled, or explained or regulated by conventional authority. Fear of people who could do things that others couldn't, who had knowledge that challenged the accepted understanding of how the world worked. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to touch something at her throat, a small pendant that Marcus hadn't noticed before. It started with whispers, rumors about our family being dangerous or unnatural. Then came the investigations, the accusations, the gradual isolation from communities that had once welcomed our help. Eventually, it became safer to scatter, to hide what we knew, to pretend we were ordinary people with ordinary abilities. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And you're not afraid that the same thing could happen here?" Luna's smile was sad but determined. "I'm terrified that it could happen here, Marcus. But I'm more terrified of what happens to the world if knowledge like this disappears entirely. There are too many problems that conventional solutions can't address. Too many people suffering from crises that only magical intervention can resolve." She gestured toward the transformed landscape around them, toward the impossible abundance that had replaced drought and despair in the space of a single night. "What we've created here proves that another way is possible, that magic and practicality can work together to solve real problems. If we can demonstrate that, if we can teach others to do the same, maybe we can change the conversation about what's possible in the world." Barnabas made a soft sound and wandered over to a section of the property where Marcus could see people approaching in the distance. Not many, just 3 or 4 figures walking across the desert. But as they drew closer, Marcus could see that they moved with the same purposefulness that had characterized Luna's arrival the day before. "Are those people coming here?" Marcus asked, squinting against the morning sun. Luna shaded her eyes and smiled. "Our first students, I believe." Word travels fast when impossible things start happening, especially in places where people have given up hope. "These are probably neighbors who've heard about the sudden return of water to your land, who've come to see if the rumors are true." As the figures drew closer, Marcus recognized them. The woman in front was Elena Vasquez, whose family had been struggling with failed crops for the past 2 seasons. Behind her walked Tom Bradley, an older man whose well had run dry 6 months ago, forcing him to truck in water at enormous expense. The third figure was someone Marcus didn't recognize, a young person who moved with a limp and carried what looked like a small bag of belongings. "They look like they're carrying everything they own," Marcus observed, noting the packs and bundles that each person bore. "They probably are," Luna said softly. "When people hear about places where miracles are happening, they tend to arrive ready for whatever comes next, even if they don't know what that might be." She opened her valise and began selecting items with careful deliberation. Butterfly wings in colors Marcus hadn't seen the day before, small bottles filled with liquids that moved like captured starlight, seeds that pulsed with their own heartbeats, and tools that seemed to shift their shape depending on who was looking at them. "Are you ready for this, Marcus?" she asked, her hands steady as she arranged her selections. "Because once we start teaching others, once we begin demonstrating that magic can be learned and shared, there's no going back to the way things were. Your life is about to become much more complicated and much more wonderful than anything you've ever imagined." Marcus looked at the approaching visitors, then at the impossible landscape that surrounded them, then at Luna and Barnabas, who had brought transformation to his doorstep in the space of a single storm-filled night. He thought about the book of magical knowledge now resting in his hands, about the responsibility of preserving wisdom that could otherwise disappear forever, about the possibility of helping others discover abilities they'd never known they possessed. "I'm ready," he said, and was surprised by how certain he sounded. I'm ready to find out what happens when magic stops being impossible and starts being practical." Luna's smile was radiant as she closed her valise and prepared to greet their first students. "Then let's begin." The morning sun cast golden light across what had once been Marcus Chen's failing ranch and was now something the desert had never seen before. 6 months had passed since Luna Brightwater arrived with her valise of butterfly wings, and Barnabas had created the first spring with the touch of his ancient wisdom. What began as 3 visitors seeking answers to impossible problems had grown into something neither Marcus nor Luna had dared to imagine. 17 people now called the ranch home, each carrying their own story of crisis transformed into possibility. Elena Vasquez had not only learned to coax life from barren soil, but could now teach others to hear what the earth was saying about its needs. Tom Bradley had discovered that his gift wasn't just finding water, but understanding the songs that underground rivers sang to those willing to listen. The young traveler who had arrived that first morning had revealed themselves as River, someone whose connection to growing things was so profound that plants seemed to reshape themselves to better serve human needs simply by being in their presence. Marcus stood on what was now called the teaching porch, watching the morning activities unfold across the transformed landscape. In the natural amphitheater that Barnabas had grown from living stone, Luna was demonstrating advanced butterfly wing magic to a group of students who had progressed beyond basic earth connection. Their laughter carried on the desert breeze as wings of impossible colors responded to their growing confidence, creating small weather systems that brought exactly the right amount of moisture to specific garden plots. Near the workshop areas, River worked with 3 newer arrivals, showing them how to encourage seeds to remember their potential instead of forcing them to grow. The youngest student, a girl no more than 16 who had fled a family that called her gifts demonic, held a sunflower seed that gradually opened in her palm, sending down roots and unfurling leaves as if time itself was speeding up around her touch. Barnabas had established himself as the ranch's unofficial guardian and guide, appearing wherever he was most needed with that uncanny timing that spoke of wisdom far beyond ordinary animal intelligence. This morning he stood near the main gate, his blue-silver fur catching the light as he observed a dust cloud approaching from the direction of the highway. His posture was alert but not alarmed, the stance of someone expecting visitors rather than trouble. Marcus felt the familiar tingle of awareness that had developed over the months, the sensation that told him when something significant was about to shift in their carefully balanced world. He climbed down from the porch and walked toward the gate, arriving just as Luna emerged from the amphitheater with that particular expression that meant she'd sensed the same disturbance in the magical currents that flowed through their sanctuary. "Government?" she asked quietly, falling into step beside him. Marcus nodded grimly. They'd both known this day would come eventually. Word of the ranch's impossible transformations had spread despite their efforts to keep a low profile. Stories of failed farms suddenly producing abundant harvests, of people with chronic illnesses finding perfect health after spending time in their healing gardens, of weather patterns that seemed to respond to human need rather than following natural laws. Such stories attracted attention, and not all of it welcome. The approaching vehicles were official. Black SUVs with government plates and the kind of tinted windows that suggested their occupants preferred anonymity. They moved in formation, 3 vehicles maintaining precise spacing as they navigated the desert road that led to the ranch's entrance. There was nothing overtly threatening about their approach, but Marcus felt his chest tighten with the weight of protective instincts he'd developed for the people who had found safety within his boundaries. "Should we gather everyone?" he asked, though he already knew Luna's answer. "No," she said softly, her hand moving instinctively to the valise she always carried. "Running and hiding sends the wrong message. We always knew we'd have to face this conversation eventually. Better to meet it head-on while we're on our home ground." Barnabas trotted over to where they stood, his presence immediately calming in the way that had become familiar to everyone who lived at the ranch. The goat positioned himself between Marcus and Luna, not defensively but as a bridge, his ancient eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles with an expression that might have been curiosity mixed with patient resignation. The lead SUV stopped just outside the gate, its engine ticking as it cooled in the desert heat. For a long moment, nothing happened. Marcus could feel the attention of his students and colleagues focused on this confrontation from across the ranch, their concern flowing through the network of connection that bound them all together. Then the doors opened, and 4 people emerged with the careful movements of individuals accustomed to approaching potentially dangerous situations. The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the transformed landscape beyond the gate. She wore a dark suit that managed to look both professional and practical, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Chen, I'm Director Sarah Walsh, Department of Unusual Phenomena. We'd like to speak with you about some reports we've received concerning activities at this location." Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times, but facing the reality felt different than he'd expected. "What kind of reports, Director Walsh?" "Reports of impossible agricultural yields, unexplained weather modifications, and individuals claiming to have developed supernatural abilities after spending time on your property." She paused, her gaze taking in the streams that flowed where no water should exist, the fruit trees heavy with produce despite the desert climate, the buildings that seemed to have been grown rather than constructed. Reports that, frankly, we would normally dismiss as rural folklore if we hadn't verified them through multiple independent sources. Luna stepped forward, her movement fluid and confident. "Director Walsh, I'm Luna Brightwater. I believe what you're really asking about is whether the changes here represent some kind of threat to public safety or national security." Director Walsh's attention shifted to Luna, and Marcus saw the subtle widening of her eyes as she took in the butterfly wings that moved through Luna's hair, the way the air around her seemed to shimmer with possibilities, the undeniable aura of someone who existed slightly outside the boundaries of normal reality. "Among other concerns, yes," the director admitted. "We've documented temperature variations, unusual electromagnetic readings, and gravitational anomalies that seem to center on this property. Our scientific team is at a complete loss to explain what they're observing." Behind Director Walsh, her companions were taking readings with instruments Marcus didn't recognize, devices that hummed and clicked and occasionally emitted soft chimes. One of them, a younger man with thick glasses and the intense focus of a career scientist, looked up from his equipment with an expression of pure bewilderment. "Director, the energy readings here are off any scale we've ever developed. It's not radioactive, not electromagnetic in any conventional sense, but it's definitely affecting local environmental conditions in ways that should be physically impossible." Barnabas chose that moment to demonstrate exactly how impossible things had become at the Chen Ranch. The goat walked calmly to a patch of obviously barren ground near the gate, lowered his head to touch the earth, and caused a small garden to spring into existence in the span of 30 seconds. Tomatoes ripened on vines that hadn't existed moments before, corn stalks reached toward the sky, and flowers bloomed in a riot of colors that painted the desert air with perfume and possibility. The scientific team's instruments went wild, beeping and chirping in what sounded like electronic panic. The young scientist stared at his readings, then at Barnabas, then back at his instruments, as if hoping they might provide some rational explanation for what he'd just witnessed. "That," Director Walsh said after a moment of stunned silence, "is exactly the kind of thing we need to discuss." Marcus felt Luna's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of solidarity that had become natural over the months they'd worked together. "Would you like to come inside, Director? I think this conversation might benefit from some context you can't get from standing at our gate." Director Walsh looked back at her team, who were still struggling to make sense of their instrument readings, then nodded slowly. "I think that would be hopeful, yes." As they walked through the ranch toward the main house, Marcus watched the government officials take in their surroundings with the careful attention of people trained to assess potential threats. But he also saw something else in their expressions, particularly in Director Walsh's eyes. Wonder. Despite their professional caution, despite their obvious concern about the implications of what they were witnessing, they couldn't help but be amazed by the beauty and abundance that surrounded them. Children played in gardens where every plant seemed perfectly healthy, their laughter mixing with the songs of birds that had returned to a desert ecosystem that now supported impossible diversity. Adults worked together on projects that blended practical necessity with magical innovation, building structures that grew themselves, tending crops that adjusted their own growth patterns to maximize nutrition and yield, creating art that seemed to capture and reflect the very essence of life itself. "How many people live here now?" Director Walsh asked as they passed a group of teenagers learning to encourage rain clouds to form in specific locations. 32 as of this morning, Luna replied, though the number changes frequently. Some people come for a few weeks of intensive learning, and then return to their home communities to share what they've discovered. Others find that their gifts work best in partnership with the land here and choose to stay longer. And you're teaching them to do... Director Walsh gestured vaguely at a woman who was having an animated conversation with a fruit tree that was responding by adjusting the ripeness of its apples to her specifications. We're teaching them to remember abilities they were born with but forgot, Marcus said. Every human being has the capacity to work with natural systems in ways that go beyond conventional understanding. Most people never discover that capacity because they're taught from an early age that such things are impossible. They reached the main house, and Marcus led the group to the large covered porch that had become the ranch's informal meeting space. Luna disappeared inside briefly and returned with a tray of refreshments that demonstrated their point more effectively than any explanation could have. The iced tea was perfectly temperature-controlled, despite the desert heat, flavored with herbs that seemed to adjust their taste to each person's preferences. The small cakes appeared to be made from ingredients that shouldn't exist, but they satisfied hunger in ways that felt nourishing to both body and spirit. Director Walsh accepted a glass of tea and took a careful sip, her eyebrows rising at the complex flavors that seemed to evolve as she drank. This is remarkable. How is this possible? It's possible because my colleague River has learned to communicate with plants in ways that allow them to optimize their nutritional and flavor profiles, Luna explained. The tea leaves understand what each person's body needs and adjust their chemistry accordingly. The herbs modify their taste and effect based on emotional and physical requirements they can somehow sense. The young scientist, who had introduced himself as Dr. Martinez, leaned forward with intense curiosity. Are you saying the plants are somehow conscious? That they're making deliberate choices about their chemical composition? Not conscious in the way humans understand consciousness, Marcus replied, but aware, responsive, connected to information systems that most people never learn to perceive. When someone develops the ability to interface with those systems, remarkable things become possible. Someone like her? Director Walsh nodded toward a student who was working with a section of desert that was transforming itself into productive farmland as they watched. Someone like any person who's willing to consider that the world might be more flexible and responsive than they were taught to believe, Luna said gently, including, potentially, people like yourselves. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Director Walsh and her team asking increasingly detailed questions about the ranch's operations, the selection and training of students, the long-term implications of the changes they were witnessing. Marcus found himself appreciating the director's intelligence and genuine concern for public welfare, even as he remained wary of the government's potential response to what they were learning. The question we keep coming back to, Director Walsh said finally, is whether what you're doing here represents a threat to established social and economic systems. If these abilities can be taught, if they can be replicated in other locations, the implications are staggering. They are, Luna agreed, but not necessarily threatening. Imagine farming communities that never have to worry about drought or crop failure. Imagine cities where parks and gardens optimize themselves to clean air and water. Imagine a world where working with natural systems instead of fighting against them is the foundation of how humans live. But also imagine, Director Walsh said carefully, the potential for individuals with these abilities to cause significant disruption if they chose to use them destructively. Imagine the economic impact on industries built around scarcity, if scarcity is no longer a natural limitation. Marcus had expected this concern, had wrestled with it himself during the early months of the ranch's transformation. Director, every person who's learned to work with these abilities has also learned that they don't function properly when used for selfish or destructive purposes. The forces we're teaching people to partner with seem to have their own intelligence, their own ethical framework. They simply don't respond to attempts to use them for harm. To demonstrate his point, he gestured toward Barnabas, who was resting in the shade nearby. Barnabas there could theoretically create devastating floods or droughts if he chose to. But his abilities are inherently connected to promoting life and balance. The magic itself seems to prevent its misuse. Dr. Martinez had been scribbling notes throughout their conversation, his scientific training apparently warring with the evidence of his own observations. From what I've seen today, you're describing something that operates more like a biological immune system than a tool or weapon. It promotes health and balance and resists attempts to disrupt those conditions. That's exactly what it is, Luna said, her smile approving. Magic, properly understood, isn't about power over natural systems. It's about partnership with them, cooperation that benefits everyone involved. Director Walsh was quiet for a long moment, her attention focused on something in the distance, where a group of students was working together to heal a section of land that had been damaged by old mining operations. As they watched, the scarred earth gradually returned to life, supporting plants and attracting wildlife in a process that should have taken decades but was unfolding over the course of hours. "What you're asking us to accept," she said slowly, "is that everything we understand about the limits of human ability, about the constraints of natural law, about the relationship between conscious intention and physical reality, is incomplete." "We're not asking you to accept anything," Marcus replied. "We're simply demonstrating what becomes possible when people are taught to work with aspects of reality that mainstream culture has forgotten how to perceive. And we're offering to teach those methods to anyone who's genuinely interested in learning them," Luna added, "including government representatives who might want to understand these abilities well enough to make informed policy decisions about them." The offer hung in the air between them, a bridge across the gap between fear and curiosity that had brought the government officials to their door. Marcus could see Director Walsh weighing options, calculating risks and benefits with the skill of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected large numbers of people. "What would that look like?" she asked finally. "If we were to participate in your educational programs?" "It would look like spending time here, working with the land, learning to perceive and interact with information systems you've never been taught to notice," Luna said. "It would mean setting aside assumptions about what's possible and allowing yourself to discover abilities you didn't know you had. And it would mean understanding that these abilities come with responsibilities," Marcus added. "The more connected you become to natural systems, the more invested you become in their health and balance. People who learn to work with these forces tend to become passionate advocates for environmental protection and social justice." Director Walsh smiled for the first time since her arrival. "Ah, so there's the real threat you represent. Not to public safety, but to systems that depend on exploitation and scarcity to maintain their power." "We prefer to think of it as an opportunity," Luna said diplomatically. "An opportunity to discover whether humanity can learn to live in genuine partnership with the world that supports us." The sun was beginning to set by the time Director Walsh and her team prepared to leave. They'd spent the afternoon touring the ranch, observing classes, talking with students about their experiences, and watching demonstrations of abilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. As they walked back toward their vehicles, Director Walsh turned to Marcus and Luna with an expression that mixed official responsibility with personal curiosity. "We'll need to file a report, of course, but I'm hoping that report will recommend further study rather than immediate intervention." "We hope so too," Marcus replied. "And if your superiors are interested in first-hand observation, they're welcome here anytime." "I may take you up on that personally," the director admitted. "What I've seen today raises more questions than it answers. But they're the kind of questions I'd like to explore, rather than suppress." After the government vehicles disappeared into the desert distance, Marcus and Luna stood together watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. Around them, the ranch settled into its evening rhythms, the sounds of people preparing meals, sharing stories, and planning the next day's work in partnership with forces that most of the world still considered impossible. "Do you think they'll cause problems for us?" Marcus asked, though he was surprised to find that the question didn't carry the anxiety it might have 6 months earlier. "I think Director Walsh is exactly the kind of person the world needs in positions of authority right now," Luna replied. "Someone intelligent enough to recognize when old assumptions no longer serve, curious enough to investigate rather than condemn, and ethical enough to prioritize human welfare over institutional convenience." Barnabas wandered over to where they stood, his presence as calming as ever. The goat looked up at them with those ancient eyes, and Marcus felt the familiar sense of communication that went beyond words. What he received from Barnabas was something like contentment mixed with anticipation, as if the goat understood that this day had marked an important transition in their work. "What's next for us?" Marcus asked, The question directed as much to Barnabas as to Luna. "Next, we keep doing what we've been doing," Luna said, opening her valise to release a handful of butterfly wings that caught the starlight and dispersed it in patterns of impossible beauty. "We keep teaching people to remember abilities they've forgotten, keep demonstrating that partnership with natural systems is more effective than domination, keep proving that magic is the most practical approach to solving the world's problems." She paused, watching as the butterfly wings settled on plants throughout their transformed landscape, each one carrying seeds of change that would continue growing long after their immediate presence was forgotten. "And we keep trusting that the world is ready for what we have to offer, even when it seems like change is happening too slowly or facing too much resistance." Marcus nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones like water soaking into desert soil. Around them, their students and colleagues continued the work of building a world where impossible things happened so regularly that they stopped being impossible and started being simply another way of being alive. In the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs to the desert moon. But now their voices were joined by other sounds. The whisper of water flowing where no water should exist. The rustle of leaves on trees that shouldn't be able to survive in this climate. The laughter of people who had discovered that they were capable of miracles they'd never dared to imagine. Marcus Chen had thought his story was about saving a failing ranch from drought and financial ruin. Instead, he'd discovered it was about learning to ground lightning, to give magic a safe place to land, to become a bridge between the world of practical necessity and the realm of infinite possibility. And as he stood beneath the vast Nevada sky, surrounded by the impossible abundance he and Luna had created together, he knew their real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.